As I am beginning to wrap up this PHP Fundamentals course, it's important that I show you the next step. So of course, there's only so much you can teach in a matter of 3 to 5 hours. So we've actually covered a great deal, but as with anything, there's a great deal more for you to learn. So far, you've learned the fundamentals. You've learned how to use the language. You've learned some of the basic features, how do you work with functions and arrays and what these things are and why you would use them. So the next step is, once you feel really comfortable in this area, is to move on to something called object-oriented programming. Now, trust me, this is something that's probably going to take you a while to wrap your mind around of. So we're going to begin our discussion on classes in the easiest possible way. The first class that we will create will specifically be for grouping related code together. And then once you understand how you create a class, what the difference is between some of these visibility options, then you can move on to the next step and start understanding the idea of OOP in greater detail. All right, so I'm going to create a new file, and this will be our very first class. So we will be working with pseudocode here, so I will call it db.php. And if you remember in the previous lessons when we were working on that blog, we had these database functions. But the problem was they were just inside some file. There wasn't any real connection between the two. Well, now we're not going to be working with those functions. Like I said, this is pseudocode, but let's see how we could go about the process of grouping that into a class. So we open up PHP, and we're going to create our first class, and we're going to call this database, or you could call it DB, anything you want to. So now we have created this new database class, and when we want to instantiate it, we can create a new instance of that class, new database. Now, technically, for a database class, that would probably be more of a singleton, but we're not quite to that point yet, so this is fine if we view it in this light. So when we create a new instance of a class, we can optionally pass in some parameters, and then those can then be set on our instance. So if you're like me, that word instance really confused me. So before we move ahead, let's comment this out and consider an easier example. Let's create an example for person, and this is very standard when learning OOP. It's sort of the hello world of creating classes. So think about a class person. What we want this class to essentially be is the blueprint. What would be the blueprint for a person? Well, a person has a gender. Generally, a person's going to have a job. A person's going to have a hair color. A person's going to have 2 eyes. A person will have a name. This is the blueprint for a person. Or think of a house. What would be the blueprint for a house? Well, this is really easy. Think of the blueprint for a new home. You can have the same blueprint, but you could have a red house, a blue house, a green house. Maybe one house has a larger backyard, but they still followed that same blueprint. And you will see this in those new subdivisions where every house is the same, but they're slightly different. So they're all using the same blueprint, but then there are specifics for each instance of the house. So I'll give you an example. When we create a new instance of a class, a function called construct, like this, will run automatically. And think of this as the initializer. When you create a new instance, even without calling this function, it will run automatically. So to test this out, let's simply echo running. And now I will view this in the browser. And now we see, of course, we do get running. So now we know when we create a new instance of a class, anything that we want to happen immediately can be added to the construct function. So imagine with this DB idea, well, when you create a new instance of your database class, probably something that you would want to have happen automatically would be to connect to the database. So that's where you would store your connection string and things like that. So now let's set some options on our house. Well, we will set public home color, like so. And if we want, we can set this to a default of white. So I will say the default home color is white. So now we've created a new instance, but why don't we store a reference to it in a variable? So I will call that house. Well, now when I run house, home color, and ignore the syntax for the time being, let's echo that out. And I will also clear out the construct echo as well. So now when I run it, yes, we do get white. So now we've successfully set a property on our class. But what's this public here? Well, this is how we define the visibility. You will also see this referred to as encapsulation. So the basic idea is when it's public, anyone can access this property. So in this case, we set home color to public. We can access it from the outside. But watch what happens when I set this to protected. Here's the next option. Reload the page, and now we're going to get a fatal error, cannot access protected property. And there's also one more called private, and we get the same thing. So we have public, protected, and private. Now the differences are, public can be accessed anywhere. So the properties and methods that you set to public would be sort of like your API. Anyone who is using your class should have access to these specific methods. But then you will also have those methods that are very specific to a class, and they're not meant to be accessed from the outside. They're just helper methods that your class requires. So we can take advantage of visibility to help the user, really. So in this case, when I say private, I'm saying this property should only be accessible from this single class and nowhere else. We don't want it accessed on the outside. We don't want any subclasses to access it. It only is available from this class. But then you have protected, and this is a bit over our head right now. Now, protected means this class can access it, of course, and any subclasses can access it as well. And by subclass, I mean you can have classes that extend other classes, and that way you gain access to those methods. So, for example, in the case of a human being class, well, that would define the base. Human being has hands, has feet, has eyes. But then you could create a subclass that extends it. And then we can have our class for man, but it can extend the human being class because a man has all of those traits, but then a man has some other things. And then a woman subclass would have her own specific characteristics. So in our case, we're going to stick with public because I want people to be able to set that. Another way would be to use getters and setters, but we're not quite there yet, so public is okay. So now I want to be able to set the house color upon instantiation. So why don't I say new house, and now I'm going to set it to red like that. So now what we want to have happen is when I echo house home color, I would like the home color to be red. But if I reload it, it's still set to white. Well, when we create a new instance and we pass these parameters, they can then be set from the construct function. So let's say home color, like that. Now, if I echo home color, and I comment this line out, reload, now notice that we do have access to that value. Good, so then at this point, I can say this, again, ignore the syntax for now, home color equals home color. Good, so if we did everything right, now when we echo out the home color, it should be red. Reload it, and yes, it is. So now we've begun building the structure for our house. And the real power of this is when you have multiple instances. So here is our first house, but now we're going to do another one. House 2 equals a new house. And this house needs to use the same blueprint, but the specifics will be different. This house will have a color of yellow. And let me add a quick break tag there, just to add some spacing. So now when I echo house 2 home color, now we have these two different instances. They use the same blueprint, but each one has their own specific traits. So now what else would our imaginary house class have? Well, maybe it could have some methods. So it could have a method maybe where we add on a new room. So we could say public function add room, like this. And then this method would then be responsible for creating the new room, whatever shape that would take. So in this case, why don't we add 1 to the number of rooms that we have? So let's create public rooms equals, and the default will be 3. But when we add a room, now we're going to say this rooms plus plus. So now let's take a look at some of the syntax we've been doing here. I've been calling these functions. We've learned these are functions, but why am I calling them methods? And the easiest way for you to think about it is within a class, your functions are referred to as methods. And just try to memorize that. That's the easiest way to think about it for now. Outside of a class, you'd call them functions. Within a class, you would call them methods. So now we've created this new public method of our house class called add room. And what this is going to do is grab our rooms property, and it's going to increase that by 1. And that's what plus plus represents. It's the same thing as doing this rooms equals this rooms plus 1. It's just a bit of shorthand. But now I want you to note how I'm accessing these properties. First, we have this. What does this refer to? This refers to the instance. So note right here, when we create a new house, we're creating a new instance of the house class. So when we refer to this within the class, we are referring to that new instance, an object that we created. Next, we have rooms, but I want you to note when we declare the rooms property, it's $rooms, like you've always created variables. But now when we access it within a class, we drop off the $, and that's something you're just going to need to memorize. So we have this, and then the name of the property without the opening $. So now whenever we call add room, we're going to take that room number and increase it by 1. So let's change this now. I'm going to delete all of this. And now I will run house, add room, and I will do that twice. So now this house should have 5 rooms. So let's echo this, and we'll say house, home color, house. So now I'm saying this white house has house, rooms, rooms. All right, let's see how that looks. Reload the page, and now we have this red house has 5 rooms. So now we have this first instance, and it has that same blueprint, but it has its own specific characteristics. And now we're going to create another instance. We're going to create another house. And if you're having trouble figuring out how this would correspond to real-world programming, well, think about it maybe a photo gallery or a photo. So a photo could have characteristics. It could have the location it was taken. It could have the coordinates of somebody's face. It could have the dimensions. It could contain any effects that should be applied to the photo. Or you could have a class for a user of your application. This user will have an address or a username, a biography, so that's specific things for that one user, but then you could have multiple users. So this user class could also maybe you need a method that will reset the user's password. Well, that could be contained within that class as well. But anyways, let's continue on. And now we're going to create a new instance. In this house, I want to be the default, so I'm going to leave that blank. And now we're going to add a handful more rooms. I'll just paste in a bunch of those. So now if we reload, I bet we're going to get an error. And yep, we do. Missing argument 1 for house construct. So remember how I left this blank? Well, we do have this default, but when our class initializes, we are expecting that. So why don't we do this? Why don't we set it to null? And now I can say if home color, then we will set that. And that'll be okay for now. So now let's come back and reload the page. And we have our first instance is red and has 5 rooms. And our second instance is a white house that has 8 rooms. So let's continue on just a bit further. What else about our house? Well, maybe a house is for sale or not. So let's do public for sale. And by default, we'll set it to true. But then I'm going to add a new method, public function sold. And what that's going to do is it's going to make this house sold. So we'll say this for sale equals false. Now the house has been sold. So now we have our first instance. This red house has 5 rooms. And now we can say if house for sale, then we can also echo it is for sale. Otherwise, we will echo it is not for sale. So let's run that, and we get this red house has 5 rooms, and it is for sale. But we can clean this up a bit. We can say echo, and we'll use ternary here. House for sale. And if that's the case, we'll echo it is for sale. Otherwise, it is not for sale. There we go. One more time, and we're getting the same thing, but that's a little bit cleaner. So let's copy that, and now we're going to do it on our second instance. And I'll paste that in like so. The only difference here is we're going to sell this house. So we're going to say house, and rather than sold, let's change it to sell so that it's more current. Sell, like that. So now we have this new house, we've added on a bunch of rooms, and we've sold it. So when we call the sell method, that's going to update the for sale property to false. So let's run it, and before I do, once again, let's add a break tag just for some spacing. Reload it, and now we have our 2 instances. The first one is red, it has 5 rooms, and it's for sale. And we should also add a space, so let's add one right there. But our next instance of the house is a white one. It has 8 rooms, and it is not for sale. It has already been sold. Okay, so that's all we're going to do in this opening lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to come back and consider this idea of a database class and how you can also think about classes as simple, convenient ways to group related functions and properties together. And finally, I want to close by saying if this still seems very blurry to you, that's okay. It took me a long time to wrap my mind around this, and I would expect it to take you a long time as well. So go back and watch this video, and I also have a homework assignment for you. I want you to read this article on NetTuts by Jason Lingstorff called Object-Oriented PHP for Beginners. It's a lengthy read. It's going to be very complicated for you, but I want you to bookmark this and try to get through as much as you can. And once your brain has flooded, watch the follow-up video where we talk about the database class, and then come back to this article and give it another read. You may need to read this article 10 times, and that's perfectly okay, because this is confusing stuff. But once you have your mind wrapped around it, you're going to be able to do some amazing things. So I'll see you in the next video.